Hello, and welcome back to High Score, the series in which I look at the various aspects behind video game music design. Last week, we took a deep dive into moods and atmospheres, and how music is used to create believable worlds and relatable avatars. There is no better time then to look at our first case study. While obviously Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild are two different games, I've grouped them together into one video as they were both covered equally in my dissertation. I'll be jumping between these games quite often throughout this video, so to make it easier to know which I'm talking about at any one time, I'll indicate in the corners of the screen which game is relevant. I'll show the game's logos when what I'm discussing applies to them, like this for Ocarina of Time, this for Breath of the Wild, and this for both games simultaneously. Why these games? As you probably know, there are a lot of video games. Hundreds upon thousands of games exist that I could have focused on instead. Why did I choose these particular titles over others, such as the smash hit The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, Attack of the Twonkies for Game Boy, or the ever popular, absolute classic Night Trap for Sega CD? No, I wouldn't have gotten away with that in my dissertation. There are a few reasons I chose these games in particular. First of all, everyone has heard of the Legend of Zelda series. Even the ancient dusty academics brought out of cold storage once a year to mark undergraduate dissertations. The series has a level of popularity around the globe, rivalled only perhaps by Mario and the increasingly beloved or detested Fortnite. Unlike these games, however, the Zelda series soundtracks are more shaped and could be considered more classically composed, written to aid their story and gameplay rather than just advertise their brand through well-known motifs. In addition to the popularity of the series, it's also one that is close to my heart. To write 10,000 words on anything, you have to care about it, and I didn't feel I could pour my heart and soul into an essay on any other games. As for the titles I chose, I needed to make a comparison throughout the essay. As such, I didn't feel I could necessarily choose my favourite titles in the series, which these two are definitely not, but rather two games which could easily be compared. Ocarina of Time follows the story of a young boy as he adventures through enemy-ridden dungeons in search of items to aid his quest in defeating the Demon King Ganondorf. By travelling back and forth through time, he frees 6 sages who bear the power to seal evil away. After overcoming further trials, the player confronts Ganondorf, commencing the final battle. Ocarina of Time was chosen because of its landmark status within just about every media industry. Seriously, people love this game. Released in 1998, it was one of the first large-scale 3D games created, and set the benchmark for almost every single future 3D adventure game. In an article celebrating the game's 20th anniversary, journalist Keza MacDonald wrote, "Ocarina of Time remains eminently playable today because so many of the things it invented became standard for any 3D game that came after it. It's this innovation on a vast scale that drew me to write about it." One of the game's main mechanics is the ocarina. By pressing buttons in specific orders, the player can use it to travel in space and time and alter the world's environment. This has many different effects on the player, which I'll discuss in the next section. Breath of the Wild was chosen for similar reasons. Although not a dimensional breakthrough, it's the first instance of an open-world environment within the series. The game's map is estimated to be a whopping 48 times larger than Ocarina of Time's. In addition to this literal new ground, the title also broke with several series traditions, such as linear progression and dungeon items. It was also the first game in the series to feature voice acting for some characters. Polygon writer Chelsea Stark suggests that these innovations, namely the flexible story structure and exploration mechanics, will influence games into this decade. It takes time for these design lessons to trickle down into other games, but my guess is that the future has already been heavily impacted by Breath of the Wild. This influence can already be seen. In 2019, Nintendo released a trailer for a direct sequel to the game. Direct sequels are uncommon in the Zelda series, only 2 previous games have followed on directly from other titles. This shows that Nintendo understand the impact Breath of the Wild had on the industry and are looking to build off of that in the future. I often joked that they would release more information about the sequel the night before my dissertation deadline, making me rewrite most of my introduction. Perhaps thankfully, at the time of writing, there's been no new information on the title, although between the initial research for this video and the recording session, they announced a spin-off title which takes place before the events of Breath of the Wild. The game opens in a dark cavern. Guided by a mysterious voice, the player meets an old man who reveals himself to be the spirit of the King of Hyrule. He explains that the evil incarnate, Calamity Ganon, has taken over the kingdom and tasks Link with defeating it and rescuing his daughter, the Princess Zelda. Located in the four corners of the kingdom are divine beasts, massive creatures with the ability to weaken Ganon. The player can choose to activate as many or as few of these as they wish before heading to Hyrule Castle, although activating fewer will result in a more difficult final battle. Breath of the Wild's soundtrack is vastly different in style and genre to that of Ocarina of Time. This is partly the reason I chose to compare them. Instead of composed tracks, the game uses lots of ambience and environmental sound. Towns and villages scattered throughout the world use more traditional tracks which often represent the culture of their locations. The game also makes use of an extensive dynamic music system to transition between pieces and to control combat audio, which changes depending on enemy level and attack timing. As you can already tell, these games' soundtracks, while very different, both use techniques described in previous videos. In the next half an hour, I'll go through how this manifests itself in a coherent soundtrack and what impact it has on the player's experience. Building a Zelda soundtrack. Let's start by looking at Ocarina of Time's learned songs. These are the melodies which the player can perform on their virtual ocarina and are encountered at various stages throughout their quest. They can be split into three broad categories. Story narrative songs. These songs are required to progress the story. As the player is expected to use them often, they are relatively simple and easy to learn and memorise. Warp songs. These are used to teleport the player around the overworld. Not all are required to beat the game. They're slightly more complex than the story narrative songs, but will be used less frequently. Scarecrow Song. This is a side quest which allows the player to create their own song to advance some other quests. This creates interesting musical situations, which I'll discuss later in this segment. Breath of the Wild's soundtrack can be split up in a similar manner, however the lack of a central musical mechanic, like the ocarina, means that each group is a little less easy to break down. These groups are ambience, cutscene, area, battle, and sound effects or jingles. I mentioned last week that games can give the player both conscious and unconscious control over their soundtracks. This can be seen in both of these titles. By moving to a location in the overworld, they can directly cause that area's theme to play. In Ocarina of Time, the background audio can be changed by travelling in time too. For example, the Kakariko village theme changes depending on whether Link is a child or an adult. As well as location, time of day and game state can also change the music. Each of Breath of the Wild's locations has a day and night theme which fade in over the field theme as the player approaches. Of course, while the player can actively choose to visit these areas, due to Breath of the Wild's huge map, it's entirely possible that they stumble upon them by accident. In this way, the player is controlling the audio indirectly. An in-game event known as the Blood Moon is used to refresh the overworld's enemies and also acts as a panic button for the game should any memory overloads occur. The event initiates its own musical sequence and repeats after a certain in-game time has passed. Here, the music is changed and altered indirectly by player activity. Ocarina of Time uses limited transitions between tracks. This might be due to the limited technology used, or the game's restricted overworld structure. Moving to a new area or triggering a cutscene activates a blank loading screen with no accompanying music. The music for the previous area stops, and once the loading screen ends, the new area's track begins. The only situation in which a transition occurs is when Link enters the range of an enemy. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, has a much more extensive transition engine in order to cope with the game's non-linear story and open world structure. When travelling between location, levels of danger, and time of day, the music gradually fades between tracks. When fast travelling, however, the game also makes use of a silent loading screen, although this one does feature some useful gameplay information. In addition to its transition engine, Breath of the Wild also makes some use of algorithmic openform. Both the game's field track and battle theme feature small variations which change each time they play. This allows the same base material to be used much more often without becoming repetitive. The battle theme also changes based on the difficulty of the opponent and the timing of the player's attacks. Ocarina of Time's Scarecrow song can be learned by the player after making their way to Lake Hylia as both child and adult Link. At this point, they'll have completed a minimum of 3 dungeons and have decent experience of learning and using other Ocarina songs. By locking it away behind this playtime, the game forces the player to have some understanding of how these songs work. As a reward for learning this, it allows the player their own free composition, treated as just as important as these other professionally composed songs. This gives the player a sense of satisfaction, which they will feel each time they hear their own composition in-game. The Sound of Hyrule. As with pretty much every other decent game ever made, both of these titles rely on atmospheres to create memorable experiences for players. For many people, their most memorable gaming moment is the first time they stepped into Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field. The soundtrack plays a big part in this occasion, with an explosive and by now very well known theme. This theme instills a sense of grandeur into the player, encouraging them to explore this brand new 3D environment. The game's boss battle themes use fast tempos to raise the player's heart rate, mirroring the intense gameplay. In the case of the game's penultimate boss, Ganondorf, an irregular time signature is used in order to throw the player out of their comfort zone. If you can't quite catch the beat, it uses a 23/16 time signature, not exactly a pop standard. Breath of the Wild also features an irregular time signature, but for a very different effect. The game's final area is Hyrule Castle, and features both an indoor and outdoor 5/4 marching theme. The use of this time signature highlights the constant military march. Heavy footsteps can even be heard in the exterior version of the track. Contrast is also used to create particularly memorable experiences. Breath of the Wild's overworld is a generally calm, serene environment. The variations on the field theme which play in the different regions combine with the environmental ambience to create a quiet, nature-filled world to explore. Consider then the shock experienced when the harsh, mechanical Guardian theme begins to play. Guardians are 8-legged mechanical robots, once designed to protect the royal family, but now inflicted with malice. They roam around the game's overworld, ready to lock onto the player with sniper-like lasers at any moment. Quite the opposite of the game's natural atmosphere. The music also reflects this. Gone are the gentle piano rolls and moments of silence, now replaced by heavy synth tracks and an edgy violin melody. The track also contains a section of irregular time signature, designed to put the player even more on edge. This, and the previously mentioned field tracks, have nothing in common with each other, and so the transition from one to the other will always take the player by surprise, possibly even scaring them. It's this startling contrast that makes the encounter so impactful. Going from calm and relaxing visuals designed to make you feel at one with nature, to the sharp, distorted Guardian melody, coupled with the disturbing sight of these spider-like mechanical beasts racing towards you, is a shock. This shock is likely to stick with the player more than fighting a regular enemy. Both games use music to aid player learning in their overworlds. Navigating Breath of the Wild's map is no mean feat. Even if the majority of it is unidentifiable forest and tundra, there are still many towns and settlements spread throughout, and their differing soundtracks will help the player identify where they are on the map. In addition to this, there are several repeated locations, such as stables. On approaching any one of these, the matching theme will play, offering the player some mode of consistency in this vast world. While Ocarina of Time's map is much smaller, I'd argue that helping the player identify their location is just as important for this title. It's easy for us to look at a 20-year-old game and immediately understand where each location is on the map and how to get there, but there are two reasons music plays an important part in this process. Number 1. The game wasn't 20 years old when it released. These days, plenty of sites have 100% completion guides and frame-by-frame walkthroughs uploaded months before games even release, so it's easy enough to look up a map if you get lost. In 1998, this wasn't the case, and so players had to rely on their own sense of location to explore. Using music to identify an area is a key part of this. Number 2. While Breath of the Wild was applauded for its large overworld, they're not something we are unfamiliar with. Modern titles seem to compete for overworld sizes in the same way young children compare their parents' garage size. In the 2010s, bigger equals better. But the whole reason Ocarina of Time was chosen for this project is because of its landmark overworld. This was something never seen before, and in many ways set the benchmark for the huge worlds we see today. Players had never explored an environment in this manner, and so music was an important part of aiding that process. In addition to world building, both games make notable use of music in their cutscenes. Ocarina of Time's song learning cutscenes often feature a longer version of the song itself. This makes these cutscenes a satisfying resolution, allowing the player to hear an extended version of the short tune they'll play so often. It also gives them some harmonic context. Breath of the Wild uses cutscenes to build the player-avatar relationship. At the beginning of the game, Link wakes up with no recollection of his past. As the player explores, they can discover memories, cutscenes which take the form of flashbacks into Link's past. These allow the player to learn plotlines and story points alongside their avatar. They're also used to develop characters. For example, one memory explores the relationship between Link and the Zora champion Mipha.
So if this Calamity Ganon does in fact return, what can we really do? We just don't seem to know much about what we'll be up against. But know this, that no matter how difficult this battle might get, if anyone ever tries to do you harm, then I will heal you. No matter when or how bad the wound, I hope you know that I will always protect you. Once this whole thing is over, maybe things can go back to how they used to be when we were young. You know, perhaps we could spend some time together.
Character development and avatar relationship building is particularly important in titles with a silent protagonist. Another feature of these cutscenes is the self-referring nature of their soundtracks. Take, for example, The King of Hyrule's Wish.
Well done there, young one.
In this cutscene, the king reveals his identity and the fate of his kingdom, then presents Link and the player with their main objective: defeat Calamity Ganon and save Princess Zelda.
I was the last leader of Hyrule, a kingdom which no longer exists. The Great Calamity was merciless. It devastated everything in its path, a century ago. It was then that my life was taken away from me. And since that time, here I have remained in spirit form. I did not think it wise to overwhelm you while your memory was still fragile. So rather than that, I thought it best to assume a temporary form. Forgive me.
The track is a variation of the King of Hyrule's theme from a previous game in the series, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, and those who recognise it will likely have guessed the king's identity before now. Using familiar tracks helps players link audio with narrative, creating more detailed characters and clearer objectives. Hey, listen. In addition to the emotional effect these games' soundtracks have, their audio is also an important gameplay mechanic. This is particularly true for Ocarina of Time, which uses the ocarina as a main mechanic. By pressing buttons in a particular order to mimic playing the instrument, the player can cause a variety of outcomes, from clearing obstacles in Link's path to warping to distant locations instantly. More importantly, it plays a large narrative role, and the player is required to make use of the mechanic to advance the story at multiple points. Early in his adventure, Link meets Darunia, the head of the rock-eating Goron race. The player must obtain the Goron's ruby from this character to advance the story, but Darunia refuses to hand it over, enraged at the player's young age. After investigating, the player learns that Darunia enjoys dancing to music, and to one song in particular. Lo and behold, by playing one of the only songs known to the player at this point, the Goron starts to dance, and the player can advance the story. Here, music is used as part of the game's narrative, and also as a mechanic used by the player with in-game effects. Outside of the ocarina mechanic, the game makes use of some other audio tricks. The player enters the Lost Woods area early in the game. This area consists of multiple similar-looking clearings, each with 2 or 3 identical hollowed-out tree trunks, through which the player can progress to the next clearing and eventually reach the forest temple. The catch? In each clearing, only one path is correct. The others will return Link to the start of the area. On approaching the correct path, the area's background music increases in volume, giving the player feedback on their choice. Of course, they could choose to simply memorise the route, as it's always the same, but the change in dynamic clearly indicates that this is the intended method of progression. A similar mechanic can be found in a later boss fight, where the boss creates multiple phantom versions of itself, and the player must use sound effects to determine the authentic version of their enemy before dealing any damage. Breath of the Wild has no central musical mechanic. The player can whistle to call their horse, but has no control over the pitch, and for most of the game, your horse will probably be about 50 miles away anyway. It does feature some of the dynamic mixing aspects mentioned above, however. Location themes fade in and out as Link approaches, as does the theme of Cass, a large bird who offers riddles for the player to complete. By using the volume of these tracks as a guide, the player can locate themselves in the overworld and begin moving towards, or away from, their sources. Should the player decide to tackle the divine beasts, they'll find themselves in large mechanical dungeons, tasked with activating 5 terminals. With each terminal that they reach, the dungeon music changes ever so slightly. These changes are subtle, but they subconsciously alert the player of their progress. Diverging timelines. There are, of course, many aspects of video game music which I haven't covered in the series yet, which apply to these games. Perhaps the most important concept is thematic material and the use of recurring themes, which I'll look at more generally next week. Each of Ocarina of Time's sages has a unique melody, which often relates to their location of origin. This helps the player connect to the character, location, and any experiences they might have had in that location. The game takes this a step further with the use of Saria's song. Saria is Link's childhood friend, and later revealed to be the Forest Sage. Not only is her theme used to identify her, but it also acts as an assist melody which Link can use to contact Saria throughout the game. Allowing the player and Link to speak with a childhood friend acts as a connection to the beginning of their adventure together. Breath of the Wild also uses motifs in this manner. Champions each have their own musical material, which can be heard both in memories concerning them and in current overworld locations which have a link to them. First, listen to the Rito champion Revali's theme. Now, notice the similarity in Teba's theme, the character who helps Link prepare to board the Rito divine beast, Vamedo. Notice the similarity? In addition to character themes, Breath of the Wild also uses music to prepare the player for in-game events. The first time the Blood Moon event takes place, a short cutscene shows to tell the player what's going on. For each repetition afterwards, however, only the audio track plays prior to the event, alerting the player through sound, not visuals. As I'll talk about more in depth next week, players can also bring musical connotations from other games. The titles focused on in this video exist at very different points of the series timeline. Ocarina of Time is only the 5th Zelda title. When playing the game for the first time, many players will have had little experience of other games in the series. In addition, the only track which references a previous Zelda title is Zelda's Lullaby, which first appeared in A Link to the Past. As such, the chances of players having previous musical connotations when playing Ocarina of Time in 1998 is very low. But, due to its legacy and landmark status in the industry, the chances of players coming back to play it from some point in the future is much higher. From this perspective, they'll have heard many tracks which are based on or influenced by music first heard in this title. For example, the Sun Song can be found in the Wind Waker's Morning Jingle. Many of the game's songs also appear in their original form in Twilight Princess, as this title is designed to be an indirect sequel to the game. These players will bring external musical connotations from other titles back to this one, creating brand new experiences. Obviously, Breath of the Wild doesn't have this luxury. At present, nobody can come back to play Breath of the Wild with experience from future games in the series. Of course, this might change when the game's sequel releases sometime in the next 20 to 30 years. In this case then, it may actually be better to look back in the series. Breath of the Wild soundtrack takes inspiration from many past titles, especially when referencing locations or characters. Many village themes are variations of tracks from previous titles, perhaps the most notable being the Rito Village theme, a remix of the Wind Waker's Dragon Roost Island. Players often mention feeling nostalgic in their first encounter with this area, likely due to this connection. Other tracks also reference past titles, such as the Hyrule Castle theme and Ganon's theme, the latter of which references a character's appearance in Ocarina of Time. Both games make use of limited surround sound. As mentioned previously, Ocarina of Time's Phantom Ganon fight requires the player to listen to sounds in order to correctly identify the version of the boss to strike down. In the far north of Breath of the Wild's Hyrule lies the Typhlo Ruins, a forest and moat shrouded in artificial darkness. Upon entering this area, shadows block out all external light, meaning the player must rely on torches and their sonic surroundings to progress. Sound effects can also be found more prominently in Breath of the Wild. While each of Ocarina of Time's items gives off a unique sound effect when used, Breath of the Wild takes this concept to the extreme. Not only does Link's movement and item usage create noise, which can be heard by nearby enemies, but his clothing and armour also make noise. This can be seen clearly with the game's stealth armour. When worn, this armour reduces Link's sonic presence, making it easier to sneak by enemies. Not only does it make his movement quieter, his currently equipped weapon also makes less noise. The game's audio mechanics combine into one larger experience for the player, each single concept having a knock-on effect on another. Conclusion. To me, it's fascinating how these games use music and sound. Both are so different in design and mechanics, and yet so many similarities exist between them. Both use music to aid the player's exploration, despite their overworlds being of different magnitudes. Transitions exist between times, places, danger levels, and game states, and yet Breath of the Wild fades seamlessly between tracks, while Ocarina of Time so often clumsily cuts between them. Both games use irregular time signatures, but in strikingly different ways. Breath of the Wild's memory system, along with the way the entire game's narrative is unravelled, creates a strong player-avatar relationship. As a player, we learn about Link alongside him, exploring this vast and empty world for the first time. Learning songs in Ocarina of Time is satisfying, as is hearing the full version of these melodies for the first time. These songs hand an element of control over to the player, and once the game is satisfied they are capable of wielding this power, it hands full musical control over in the form of the Scarecrow song. Both titles use thematic material in a similar way, to help the player sort their experiences and to identify key characters and events more easily. While Saria's song allows the player to connect with an earlier point in their adventure, the Champion's themes help the player and Link learn more about the past and the world they're exploring. Both games also use sound effects and surround sound to challenge the player and to test their sonic awareness. Ocarina of Time isn't scared to wield music as its embodiment of player control. This is perhaps easier for the earlier game to do, seeing as music is entwined into its very mechanics. The player uses it to progress the story, travel between locations, and even travel through time. Music is woven through the game's DNA in a way that Breath of the Wild just can't manage. If music is woven through Ocarina of Time's DNA, then it creates an aura around Breath of the Wild, one which doesn't necessarily change how the player progresses, but that is always present. It helps them place themselves in a huge overworld and identify danger when it is near or progress when it seems so far away. Music is a companion to the game's overall mission, but an important one that would be missed by the player were it absent. Hopefully now you're a little clearer on how these games make use of sound and music to enhance the player's experience. Sitting hearing me talk about abstract theory is all well and good, but I think it's important to see some examples in order to understand how this manifests itself in a real game. That's partially why I chose to focus on particular titles in my dissertation. While that dissertation ended up being focused on these games, I initially planned on using Breath of the Wild and another title, Celeste, as my case studies. Obviously this never panned out, but I did have enough research on Celeste to warrant a video of its own. If you haven't played the game, it has an amazing soundtrack, and I'd recommend you at least listen to or watch a playthrough before I talk about it in the new year. With that, this video is finally coming to an end. It's been a long one, but hopefully you understand why. I could talk about these games for hours and hours on end, and so I think I've done quite well to narrow it down to 10 pages of script. Here are my resources and music list for this video. No doubt I've probably given you more questions than answers, so remember you can always send anything that comes to mind through the usual channels. Next week, I'll be back to theory, talking about the use of thematic material and recurring themes, which will all link into that video on Celeste. I hope you can join me then.